This is so bizarre.
Okay, I'm going to my program now.
Acceptable to be third world when your name has been extracted from your tongue and its gravitas unearthed from your mind. With fragments in our hands, attempted recreating beauties lost to the sleeping moon, Africa. You are the essence of innovation and origin of civilization. How have you forgotten the root of all life? The first human words were spoken by you. You cradled mathematics, rocked navigation, pressed paper from papyrus reed, burped pyramids. Were visionaries before we were accredited, so we exhaled the future. Exponential innovation and thinking for you was not a program incubated in a hub. It was your communal daily bread, imagination, the language with which we spoke to each other. Fear irrelevance brewed by old knowledge. Fall in love with the future you have not kissed. Set your own table before the world. Deck it with your own systems. Feast on your force to drape descendants with a power. Not all that is foreign is greater than your own. Hone your force. Own your age.
Over to you, Captain.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I know it's a little bit early. I can see there's still people joining, but I suggest we just get started. I believe the session is being recorded, so in case you miss the beginning, then you will have a chance to see it later. Okay. First of all, welcome. My name is Halfdan Lunge, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. I'm also the founder and non-executive director of Sauti, which is a data science startup specialized in crowdsourcing and mobile-based survey. I'll be running this masterclass with my colleague, Rehotsefetse Chikane, who is, I believe his video is also on, so Rehotsefetse, maybe you could just say hi, so people know who you are. Great. Rehotsefetse is also a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, and we'll be running this masterclass together. Let me just shift to my slides here 1 second. There. Okay, just a quick little info. So if you want to learn more about our work or want to get in touch, you can go to the website of the Wits School of Governance, where you can read more about what the school does, our different programs, and you can also read about our research, which broadly explores the effect of digitalization on governance and public policy. Alternatively, check out the website of the Civic Tech Innovation Network. We're doing some work with the CTIN on civic tech in Africa and in South Africa specifically. I'm not sure there's information there already, but if not, then it will be there soon. So stay tuned. Okay, I want to kick off by telling you a little bit about Estonia. It's a small country in Northern Europe, approximately the size of, a little bit bigger than the province of Gauteng, but a very, very small country. So about 30 years ago, Estonia gained independence from the Soviet Union. Basically, the country was left with nothing. There was no infrastructure. There was no functioning administration. There was no legal code. Basically, there was nothing. Everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. And I would say more out of necessity than anything else, the leaders of Estonia turned to technology. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I'm getting lost here in my slides. I apologize for that. 1 second. Just bear with me 1 second. I will be right with you. There. Okay. Sorry for that. So as I said, the country turned to technology as a solution, as a way of rebuilding the country. And today, Estonia is probably the most digitalized country anywhere in the world. Everything is practically done online. In 2001, Estonia introduced taxes. Estonians started filing their taxes online already in 2001. In 2002, they introduced a digital signature and digital identity online. In 2005, okay, we are already talking 15 years ago. In 2005, they started voting online. And today, practically all services are delivered online. If you want to register a business, you do it online. If you want to access education, you do it online. If you want to file a complaint, if you want to challenge a speed ticket or a parking ticket, you do it online. In fact, all services are available online. It's much easier to talk about the services or to point to the public services that Estonians cannot access online. And there's really only three things. Estonians have to show up in person if they want to, or when they have to collect their ID, their identification card. They have to show up in person if they want to get married or they want to divorce, and they have to show up in person if they want to sell property. Everything else is available online. Sorry. Now, you may ask yourself the question, why is this relevant when we're talking about digitalization and public policy and governance in South Africa? But here, I think it's important to keep in mind where Estonia came from. As I said before, 30 years ago, the country was left with practically nothing. I'm going to show you a couple of slides that show the sort of development in Estonia over the last 30 years. So this first slide here looks at GDP per capita. And as you can see, Estonia today is a lot more, I mean, the GDP per capita is much higher than South Africa. It's about four times higher. But I want to show you what I want to show you here is that until 2000, it was almost the same, around $4,000 measured in current US dollars. So until 20 years ago, again, the GDP per capita of the two countries was almost the same. And then, as you can see, Estonia really took off and is now among the 30, 40 richest, wealthiest countries in the world measured as GDP per capita. We see a similar pattern if we look at tax revenue share of GDP. So this is interesting because tax revenue as a share of GDP tells you something about the extent to which the government and the state is able to implement or to push through sort of substantial reforms, in this case, digital reforms. And as you can see, again, until 95, it was almost the same. You can see, of course, there's a big increase in the early 19, which is when Estonia became independent and started having an independent fiscal system. But around 95, it was almost the same. And since then, actually, South Africa has increased its tax revenue as a share of GDP, whereas Estonia has remained fairly constant. So in terms of fiscal resources, you would expect that South Africa has, if not more, then certainly the same capacity to implement substantial reforms in the public sector. Obviously, this only has to do with state capacity and preparedness, but I also want to show you a couple of other slides that show you the use of technology in the population. So this here shows you the number of mobile phone subscriptions per 100 people, and as you can see, it's almost the same. In fact, today South Africa has more mobile subscriptions than Estonia. When we look at the use of internet, you see that Estonia does have or a bigger share of the population uses internet regularly. But here it's important to keep in mind that the use of internet is not only it's not, how should I put it, it's not a cause, it's not necessarily a driver of Estonia's digital reforms, it's also a consequence. Already in 2001, I think Estonia launched the first free public Wi-Fi area, and in 2011 they had about 2,500. And keep in mind, this is a small country. Again, it's a little bit bigger than Gauteng, but smaller than all of the other South African provinces. So already in 2011 they had 2,500 free public Wi-Fi areas across, so in cafes, restaurants, petrol stations, etc., you name it. This is just to, yeah, and in 2013, as you see on the slide, in 2013, the 4G network, already seven years ago, then the 4G network covered around 95% of the country. Now, obviously, you cannot compare the two countries sort of one-to-one. So I just want to acknowledge that there are differences here. Estonia obviously benefits from its geographical positions in Europe. It can trade with its neighbors. It has access to supply chains throughout Europe. It can benefit from knowledge transfer from its neighboring countries that include some of the most advanced economies in the world. By contrast, South Africa has its unique history that includes colonialism and apartheid and the resulting socioeconomic disparities we see today. So that is important to keep in mind here. But still, I think it's a relevant comparison to show that Estonia was able to implement reforms over a period of 10, 20 years. In 10, 20 years, the public sector of Estonia was completely transformed. And a key driver of this was the use of technology and the use of data science. And as you can see also, that has been, I mean, I'm not going to attribute Estonia's economic success only to its effective digitalized public sector, but it's certainly a driver. So again, we called this Masterclass Digitalising Governance 101, but actually perhaps a more appropriate title would be Getting to Estonia. I mean, how do countries get to Estonia? So that's really what we'll be talking about today. So a quick overview of what we'll be doing. The agenda is quite straightforward. So I'll start out by talking about 20 minutes, a little bit about the changing nature of data and how we can process data and how we can use this information, the data, and our ability to analyze and process data, how we can use it for public policy purposes. Then we'll do some group work. We're going to give you a little task. I'll present you with a scenario, and then we'll split into two groups. And then I want the two different groups to come up or come up with a possible solution to this little dilemma or little problem. But we'll talk more about that later. After the group work, Rehotefetse will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we should still have about 25 minutes for Q&A, discussion, etc., etc. But I'm hoping we can make this interactive. I'm not sure how many people are we right now. I see about 15 participants currently. So I'm hoping we can make it interactive. So please use the chat function. I hope you have it open. So please use the chat function. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We will have, again, a Q&A session at the end. But if there's anything that isn't clear, please just write your question or comment in the chat room. During the Q&A, try to use, I hope you're familiar with Zoom, so try to use, there's a blue hand function. So if you raise your little blue hand, then I know that you want to say something or want to comment on some of the things we're discussing. So try to use that, the chat function and the little blue hand. Okay, so let's get started. I want to start out by pointing to 3 trends in data and our ability to process data, and it's really sort of setting the scene or laying the groundwork for some of the stuff we'll be talking about later on, and what Rehotzefetze will be talking about later. So the first big trend when we talk about data is that data volumes are increasing. This chart here shows you that the annual size of the global data sphere, so the amount of data that's available in the world, has been increasing. I mean, this probably doesn't come as a surprise, and you may have seen this graph or similar graphs before, but it's really just to show you that the total amount of data that we have available in the world is constantly growing. And today we have, or the estimated amount of data is around, so I think around right now, because this is all based on estimates, but estimates today are around 60 to 70 zettabytes. Currently, we are expecting that we'll reach around 60 to 70 zettabyte this year, and as you see from this graph here, in 2025, we estimate that we'll have a total of 175 zettabytes. I mean, most people have no idea what a zettabyte is, and followed by 21 zeros, okay? I think the correct English term for it is a sextillion, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Point here is that it's an incredibly big number, and it's almost impossible to relate to. So it's 75 zettabytes. It's around 6 billion stacks of books or 23 stacks of DVDs. You remember the little DVDs that no one really uses anymore, but about 5 years ago, everyone used to watch movies, etc., etc. It's around, or it's the same amount that you can include in 6 billion stacks of books or 23 stacks of DVDs reaching from Earth to the moon. So it's just unbelievable. If you were to download all of this data with a regular sort of a 10 megabits per second fiber connection, it would take you approximately 4.5 billion years. Okay, so we are talking massive amounts of data, and we cannot even comprehend how much data it is. The second trend I want to point out is that the nature of data is changing. Okay, so we tend to think of data as sort of very, we call it structured data. So imagine an Excel spreadsheet where you have, it's a nice, neat data set where you have variables in the columns, and you have observations in the lines. So very sort of neat, nice thing that we can analyze in Excel spreadsheet, or we can use statistical software, sort of very simple, straightforward stuff. Now, in actual fact, most data today is what we call unstructured. Okay. Unstructured data would be photos, text files, video files, audio files, social media sites, blog posts, etc., etc. And a lot of this stuff is actually, we refer to it as data exhaust. So data exhaust is just data that is produced as a consequence of our online presence. So it's not really data we collect per se. It's just the trail that we are leaving after us as we move around on the internet. This graph here shows you the relationship between structured and unstructured data. As you can see, already today we have far more unstructured data than we have structured data. I think, excuse me, unstructured data currently increases at 50 to 60% every year. So it's growing at a rate of 50 to 60% every year. The amount of structured data we have is also growing. But as you will see here, this is the blue part of the columns there. It's growing, but it's growing at a lower rate, which means, relatively speaking, we constantly have more and more, relatively speaking, we have more and more unstructured data relative to structured data. The second chart here, graph shows you that how much of this data is what we call real-time data. So real-time data is the data it's available immediately after we collect it, right? So that would be, again, your online present generates real-time data, GPS generates real-time data, the data that's collected when you use your mobile phone or when you complete financial transactions. All of this stuff is real-time data, and that part of the global data sphere is also increasing. Again, this is purely based on estimates, but this year suggests that by 2025, approximately 30% of the total amount of data we have will be collected real time. So those are the first two things. The third trend is that our processing power is constantly improving, okay? So processing power is really the capacity with which computers can process information. And that is important because it tells something about how much data we can analyze and how quickly we can analyze that data. The more processing power we have, the more analytical capacity we have, the more knowledge we can extract from all of this data that's available. So you may have heard of Moore's law, and Moore's law describes, or basically it suggests that the number of transistors, as written there in the chart, the number of transistors on an integrated circuit chip doubles approximately every 2 years. Okay, so that sounds a little complicated, and it's really just sort of engineer talk for saying processing power, and therefore our capacity to process data doubles every 2 years. Those of you who are good with math, you would look at this chart and say, why does it double every 2 years if the relationship is linear? You can see this seems to suggest a linear relationship, but just want to point out here that this y-axis is exponential. So the actual relationship over time, or the increase over time, is also exponential. Okay, so so we have these three big trends. The data volumes are increasing. Our capacity to process data is increasing, and what does that mean for public policy? What is the implication for public policy? So in public policy, it's common to talk about a policy process or a policy making cycle. And I'm just trying, there's a lot of, I mean, and public policy specialists and academics can discuss a lot about, you know, what are the different steps and what is the actual sequence of the steps, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just giving you one of the different models, and it's probably a very relatively simplified one. So the policy making process starts with problem identification, proceeds to agenda setting. That's when we sort of put policy issues or issues of public interest on a public agenda. We then start the actual policy formation, which leads to decision making. Obviously, in democracies, policies have to be adopted through some kind of decision making process. And only once it's been approved or adopted, we then move into policy implementation. And when whatever policy we've developed, when that's been implemented, we typically evaluate it in some way. And we use the findings of that evaluation to then identify new problems. So we have this sort of continuous cycle of policy making where we put things on the agenda, we develop solutions, we implement the solutions, and we try to learn from the implementation. So this sort of linear approach to policy making, or sort of circular linear approach to policy making has implications. First of all, it slows down the policy making process. Okay, so I'm showing you a picture of an oil tanker, and the metaphor here is that public policy is often, or changing public policy direction is often like changing direction of an oil tanker. It takes a lot of time. Okay, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of energy to even to steer this ship in a slightly different direction. It's an extremely slow process, and as you can see from this picture, I mean, to turn an oil tanker, it probably, you know, you need several kilometers or several miles to turn it around. The same is the case for public policy. It's an extremely slow process, and requires a lot of energy, a lot of input. Because it's so slow, it also means that it's difficult to make corrections to public policy. Okay, so because we have this very defined cycle, once policies are set in motion, once we've identified a policy, once we start implementing policy, we rarely make changes to policies until we've completed perhaps 1 or 2 years of policy implementation, and we start seeing the consequence of it. So it's very difficult to make these corrections, even when at an early stage we start seeing signs that the policy does not work the way it was intended. It's difficult to make these corrections. It's a very heavy process. And again, the third implication there, it's related. It means that because it's so slow, because it's so difficult to change, policymakers tend to be relatively conservative. They want to play it safe, okay? Though they may not. So they choose the conservative options when they're presented with different policy alternatives. They choose the conservative options because it means that even though they may not get the best outcomes of their policies, certainly they cannot be blamed for doing something completely wrong, or do something that has sort of indirect or unforeseen consequences, negative consequences. So it slows down the process. It means that the process is very difficult to change, and because it's difficult to change, it also means that policymakers are perhaps afraid of being innovative and creative when it comes to public policy. Yeah, a key point here is to say, because the volume of data is increasing, because our capacity to process data is increasing, it also means that we can engage in more creative and innovative policies. Okay, so coming back to the policy cycle, this constant information, this constant data that we are generating, it essentially creates these feedback loops in the policymaking cycle. So at every stage of the policymaking cycle, we have constant information about what is happening, what is the implication, and it gives us this constant feedback of information and data. It gives us the opportunity to make corrections, okay? So instead of having this very linear, or not even linear, but certainly one directional policy making cycle, we have more of an iterative process where we take a step forward, we evaluate, and then we correct, and we can take a step forward and evaluate, okay? Simply because nowadays, almost every stage or every policy action we take will create information and create data. And all of that data can be used. Sometimes we're not necessarily creating data that directly measures what we are doing or what we are implementing, but there will be some kind of, again, data exhaust that we can use. And by using sophisticated data science, advanced data science, we can extract information from that, and we can learn from that, and we can use this information to correct the direction of what we are doing. Okay. So I want to give you a little example of how information or how data science can be used for public policy purposes. So I'm going to describe a scenario, and or a problem faced by, in this case, it's the Togolese government. It's a problem faced by the Togolese government, and I'll tell you what they did to address it. The group work that we're going to do in about 5 minutes will be based on a similar model. So I'll introduce a problem or scenario, and then we'll split into 2 groups, and we'll then have a discussion about what could be a way of addressing this problem. So all I'm saying is you need to pay attention now, because what you will do yourself is similar to what I'll be doing in the next couple of slides. Okay, so again, the first example here is from Togo. So Togo, like many other countries, if not all countries in the world, in response to COVID-19, they started distributing these relief packages to people in need and households in need. In Togo, again, as I guess most countries in the world faced a dilemma, which is who do you help first? If resources are limited, and you are then faced with this scenario where you have to choose who do we help first? What household do we prioritize in the first stage, and what household can we perhaps push to a second or third stage of implementation? So in Togo, they needed to find out who were the people most in need. The problem in Togo, and the problem that the Togolese government had, was that they don't have good data. Okay, there's no proper data available. The reason for that is that existing registries, as I write here, the existing registries are out of date, as most people work in the informal sector, which means they're not filing tax returns, and then there's little information about their financial activity, their economic activity, and therefore also for poverty rates. So it's extremely difficult for the Togolese government to fully know, because again, they might have aggregate information at provincial level or even district level, but here we're talking about sort of household targeted relief, and they have no information about the sort of economic situation of different households. And obviously, in the middle of a pandemic, they couldn't go out and start collecting new data simply because it would put the enumerators at risk. So what did the government do? The solution in this case for the Togolese government, and again, it's not the only solution. There might have been different solutions, but I'm just presenting you with the solution that the Togolese government opted for. So the solution in their case was to integrate existing household data and satellite imagery, and then use deep learning, which is very sort of advanced machine learning, use deep learning to analyze this data. They didn't have the capacity themselves, and I'll tell you, I'll try to explain exactly what they did in the next slide. Is just to say they didn't have the capacity in-house. I mean, I think a lot of governments, certainly in Africa, will not necessarily have the data science skills to conduct very complicated data science analysis themselves. So they partnered with something called the Center for Effective Global Action, and oops, sorry for that. And sorry, I'm struggling with the menus here. The Data Intensive Development Lab, both research institute at Berkeley University in San Francisco. So they partnered with these two research institute and came up with this solution. So I'll try to explain exactly what they did. We can skip this here in the interest of time. Okay, so this here is a satellite image of Lomé, or a neighborhood in Lomé, the capital of Togo. Imagine, or the situation was for the Togolese government was they had household survey data available. But again, when you collect survey data, you don't have information about all households. You only have information about a sample of household, right? So typically they will sample perhaps 1,200 or 2,500 households, and they will go out and interview the household to get information, or household members to get information about this household. So they had household survey data available, but only for a couple of houses. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. So imagine they only had information about these households here. So because they had household survey data, they knew approximately what the household income of these houses were. So I was trying to just imagine that, you know, the first household here is 2,000 CFA per day. Second household has 5,000 CFA per day, and the last household has 1,500 CFAs per day. At the same time, they had satellite imagery, and it's important to keep in mind that, you know, there's a satellite crossing practically every city in the world. Sorry, there's a sunlight coming to my face. I hope you can still see me. We have satellites crossing us all the time, and it's probably, I'm not even sure, but I suspect there's a satellite crossing every point on the Earth, perhaps every half an hour or every hour of the day, which means that everyone, or we all have access to satellite, sort of high resolution satellite imagery. This was the case also for the Togolese government, and based on analysis of satellite imagery, they were able to, and by integrating that with the household survey data. So now they don't just have information about the household income. For a select number of households, they have information about household income, but also about the size of the household and, for example, the roof material. Okay, so based on this, based on analysis of the satellite imagery, they can determine what material the roof is made of. I'm just using examples here, metal sheets, etc., etc. So in addition to that, so they have information based on these satellite images. They have information about the household size and the roof material, but they also have information about the distance to different points. Okay, so imagine this here is a school. Then they can estimate the distance, or they could estimate the difference between each household and the distance to the nearest school. And in principle, they can do that for other things as well. The distance to the nearest hospital, the distance to the nearest police station, the distance to the nearest road, etc., etc. All of these things can be extracted from a satellite image, and it can be done automatically. Okay, so we now have, or we have a sample data set with information about income and all of these parameters that can be extracted from satellite imagery. So if we imagine we have this house up here, okay, we don't have information about the household income because it was not included in our survey. So we don't know, but what we're interested in, and what the Togolese government needed to know, was the household income in order to determine whether this household needed some kind of relief package from the government. But we don't know the income. Now, we do know the size of the house, we do know the roof material, and we do know the distance to the nearest school. Okay, so we don't know the primary variable that we are interested in, but we have information about all these other things. By using deep learning, we can explore the correlates in this now very complicated data set. Okay, because we can look at the correlations between all of the variables that we have available, all of the variables we can extract from the satellite imagery. And on that basis, we can estimate the household income of a house. We don't know what the household income is, but we can build a model that predicts the household income based on the satellite image we have available almost real time, because the satellite is crossing us every 30 to 60 minutes. And we can then almost real time monitor household incomes and poverty levels, okay? And we can use that information to sort of infer from household we've looked at. We train a machine, we train a model to predict the household income of other households. Okay, I know it sounds a little bit complicated, but I just want to start thinking of data in a different way, and think about the possibilities that exist when we integrate different sources of data and different types of data, and use advanced data science, and use machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence to analyze the data and learn something about people, household, things that we don't know anything about. Okay. So the result for the Togolese is very quickly here. The result for the Togolese government was not only did they were able to respond very quickly to the COVID-19 pandemic and allocate scarce resources effectively. So that was the immediate concern. But in addition to that, they have actually been able to develop this very fine-grained measure of poverty that can be used to monitor poverty levels, and also the effect of relief efforts and other development interventions, again, almost real time. So they addressed the immediate concern, but in addition to that, they have built this tool that can be used for public policy making also in the future. And they will have a constant, flow of information and data about how poverty levels are changing over time through this, again, almost real-time feedback of satellite imagery, or availability of satellite imagery. And this model or machine learning algorithm that can predict or estimate poverty levels on an ongoing basis. And in fact, the more data we feed this algorithm, the more it will optimize itself. That's in essence how machine learning works. Okay, so that was a little example from Togo. So the next thing we'll do is to try to split into groups, and I've taken a little bit more time, but I hope we can still make it. So we'll split into two groups, and I will moderate the first group, and Rehotefetse will moderate the second group. And I'll give you just now in the next couple of slides, I'll give you a scenario or a problem, and then in the group we want to discuss the problem, and we want to come up with a possible solutions. And each group will then present their solutions to the rest. Okay, so this scenario is from Mozambique, and it's actually a real life scenario. So in Mozambique, it sounds a little dry, but I'll try to also explain the possible implications of this missing piece of information. So in Mozambique, price data, okay, inflation data, prices of food, for example, is collected only in the three main cities, Maputo, Beira, and Nampula. Very little is known about inflation outside of these areas. Okay, we have other data sets, but they are very incomplete, and data is only collected every couple of years. Because of that, we know very little about price data and inflation in the rural areas, although around 2/3 of the population in Mozambique live in rural areas, okay? Now, we know from research that there's a big difference between prices and inflation in urban areas and rural areas. But the Mozambican government only has information about price and inflation data, or inflation information in the urban centers. And because of this, it makes it difficult for the government and the central bank also to adjust its fiscal and monetary policies, because they don't have information. So they are developing policies on the basis of the information that's available to them, and that information is limited to only these three urban centers. In addition, inflation, so as you probably know, inflation data, or in most countries, inflation data is collected by enumerators in the field, and that's also the case in Mozambique. This specific picture is from the census. You can even see that the lady has it says census 2017. So this was in 2017 when Mozambique completed this last population and households census. But it's just to illustrate that the process is almost the same. It's actual people, actual enumerators that are sent into the fields, and they then go around and collect information about prices in markets, et cetera, and they compile that information and send it back to the National Statistical Institute. Because of that, this process or the collection of data is extremely slow. It's also expensive because it's in a country like Mozambique, where it's a huge country, very poor infrastructure, and it's extremely expensive to then train all these enumerators, deploy them to the field, and get them to collect data, and then bring them back and process all of this information before you can start calculating or extracting information about inflation. So it's very, very slow, and because it's slow, it's also expensive. Also, because of the cost, the sample sizes are relatively small. And as some of you probably know from if you've done any intro to stats, then if sample sizes are small, that increases the margin of error. And there's obviously also the possibility of human errors. When we have hundreds of people deployed to the field, they have to complete, sometimes they complete it manually, sometimes they have a little device and they enter information directly on this device, but still there's a lot of room for human error, and sample size is also well, the combination of sample sizes and the fact that it's collected by human means this data is very, very, very poor quality. Okay, so that's the scenario. The Mozambican government doesn't have information about price data or inflation data, or it has only information about price and inflation data for these 3 urban centers. The consequence of that is that its policy responses, both fiscal and monetary policy responses, are slow and often incomplete, simply because there's not enough information. They don't have the basis for taking fully informed decisions. What I want you to do is to try to think of a possible solution. What could be a solution for the Mozambican governments? Is there any way that we can use technology, that we can build a platform, use alternative sources of data, use alternative ways of analyzing data to develop a solution for the Mozambican government? If we had more time, I would give you a quick sort of crash course introduction to some of these technologies, but I hope, I mean, the groups will probably be around, so we are 21 participants right now, so the group will probably be 10 in each, and again, I will join one of the groups and Rehotefetze will join the others. So if you have questions about these different technologies and these different ways of analyzing data, we can perhaps discuss it in groups. But the idea is try to think of how technology, how data science can be used to generate better, faster, sort of higher frequency information about food prices, specifically food prices. This is probably the most interesting thing, food prices in Mozambique, that will allow the Mozambican government to respond a lot quicker. Okay, so I will try to split you into 2 groups because let me try to do it myself. We are having technological difficulties here. Melissa, can you help, you think?
I can only do it if I'm host. So only you can do it because you're the host right now.
Oh, okay. So if I give you, if I make you the host, then you can do it. Yeah. Okay. I will do that now. There. Just bear with us for a few seconds, then we'll split you into 2 groups and we'll start this group work.
How long do you want them to be?
I think perhaps let's try to do 15 minutes because we are running a little bit over time. So let's do 15 minutes.
So it's just taking a bit of a...
And half done, whilst Melissa is helping, just check your phone. I just sent you a message.
I'm doing it now. I've moved you back to breakout 1.
Melissa, did you set the rooms with only 1 minute because they're busy closing?
Yeah, I'm seeing that. It just said close. I don't know why.
I think you might have set it for 1 minute. Can you cancel it? Or you can't?
No, it has to run for a few seconds first. But
Okay. All right. So yes, ours just closed. We had 9 people, then it closed. So I think everybody's coming back here.
gosh, these seconds are quite long when you're.
Is Jehoshaphat is also going to close?
Yeah. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. I think.
Hello.
Hey, sorry. I think we just got moved back to the main room, which is perfectly fine. There's no issues there. Hopefully we do not get kicked off again. Is everyone still with me? I think it's going to be the 13 of us. If anything changes, just bear with us. But I do want to hit the ground running because we don't have a lot of time. But this session's really focused on how we solve this problem that Hafdan has kind of gone over. Before I start, I just want to make sure, is everyone on the same page about the challenge that Hafdan has explained? Is there any questions of clarity that people want to have? I'm going to put it back up on the screen now, just so you have your own particular reference. I also hope that the silence is not because my voice is extremely boring and is draining the life from you on this cold Wednesday morning. Is everyone with me? Just give me a quick high five, hand up, quick yes, if you can hear me and you're on the same page with me.
Understood.
Cool, fantastic. Cool. So as Hafdan talked about, we're trying to come up with a solution for the Mozambican government, right? The lack of information that they have at their disposal has created a situation in which, I hope you guys can see my screen, has created a situation in which making any sort of monetary policy is completely clouded with tons of uncertainty, right? You are sitting in a situation, move this out of my way. I think we haven't split up completely here, but I'm just going to keep just for time's sakes. You're sitting in a situation in which you have, I think Hafdan is back with us.
I'm moving into room 2.
Okay, cool. You're sitting with a situation where inflation data is collected in a very manual sense, right? Hafdan, apparently you're going to be moved away from us. And because of that, it makes it extremely slow and extremely expensive to collect this type of data, right? And with these small type of samples, there's huge room for errors. And when you make error around this type of data sets, the implications of it can actually be quite dire for economic policy, fiscal monetary response that you want to have as a country. As Hafdan has explained, there's a very rural community, not rural community, but the nature of Mozambique poses certain challenges. Let me just do this. Right. And we're trying to figure out, how do we help them get better data? How do we help them get richer data? And what potential avenues would you guys suggest? I mean, you guys work in this field, that you're all experts in one way or another, and more often than not, the solutions that get proposed for these type of problems are things that we already know or have some sort of implicit idea. So I'm going to leave you guys to kind of discuss by yourselves. I'm simply here to moderate and to answer any questions you might have, but this is really up to you. I would also suggest that you choose someone from this group, or you just get a volunteer, probably just get a volunteer to avoid time wasting, who will then send back to the rest of the plenary. Understand that. If anyone who wants a clarification, of what I just said?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Is that Charles? Charles, I feel like I want to be a bit of a dictator and make you the lead of the discussion.
Oh boy, I put my foot in it, eh?
Yeah, this is the problem about being that brave person who speaks on.
Let's see how we do with the group. Maybe someone more brave might pop up, but it's all right. Yeah, I'll take it from here. It's all right. Thanks.
Cool, fantastic. So what are your guys' suggestions? What do you think possible solutions to?
Hi.
I'm Melissa.
I'm trying to figure out why the people in here are not moving, because you have a lot of people, but they're just not joining the room. They have to accept my invite.
Oh,
So,
okay. So what do we do?
because the other group is already underway, so I don't know how.
Yeah, I could see Rotefet. I ended up in the other room and I could see he's already. Okay, you know what? I think we'll just get started, even if it's a small group. And if you can see what you can do on your side, if you can assign more people to this group. But I think we'll just get started. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. So small group here, 4 people. The first thing, so again, the task here is to, let me see if I can bring back the slides here just for your reference. So again, I just want to sort of recap or remind you of what the task is here. So we have this situation where information about prices, food prices, is very limited, and it's extremely important for a government like the Mozambican government to understand what's happening with food prices, because it has a direct effect on poverty levels and hunger. The government only has information about food prices in the urban centers, although the vast majority of the population live in the rural areas. So the challenge here is really to come up with a possible solution for the Mozambican government. Is there any way we can try to use alternative data that's already available and analyze that with some kind of sophisticated data science technique, and you know, please be creative and don't be restricted to you know what sounds realistic, but think of alternative creative ways of using technology and data science to address this problem. One of you will have to report back to the entire group. So I don't know if there's someone who's willing to be the, I don't know, the group chair or rapporteur, whatever we want to call it. I hear only silence. How about Fumulani? Would you be okay with? I mean, we'll help you, and I'll also be there to facilitate. Just we need someone to do it, Fumulani, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Hi.
Yes, I'm here. I can present.
Okay, great. Okay. So we'll have a discussion about what could be a solution, and then you can just, if you can just take a couple of notes, and then when we go back to the plenary room, then you'll present, and it's really just, you know, summarize our discussions and propose a solution, if that's okay with you. Okay, anyone wants to kick off? I mean, I don't know much about you and where you're coming from, what your professional background is, but have you been faced? I don't know if you work in public sector, private sector, in civil society. I don't know if you've faced similar situations where you have to think of ways of applying or deploying technology and data science to specific problems. No one? I mean, I know that, I mean, price data and inflation data, it sounds a little bit dry, but I'm sure you know, I'm sure you've seen or heard discussions and seen reports in the newspapers or on TV about inflation going up, inflation going down, and it really has an enormous impact on sort of both the macroeconomy of a country, but also in this specific case, it's really about poverty and rural poverty in Mozambique. If, you know, food prices for some reason increase, if the price of cassava or rice or something goes up by...
Cool. Oh, now it looks like Melissa herself is joining us. Melissa, are you going to fix us?
Yes, I'm trying to figure out why your host is not here. He's in the room, but he's just not in the room. It's weird.
He was here and then he vanished. So I don't know, maybe if he can hear us, or if you can tell him to exit the room, then he'll go back to the main room, then you can put him back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. He's here. He and three.
Otherwise, I take over the lecture, then you guys can pay me.
Let's see.
How are we doing on time? Does anyone know how much time we've got left?
Yeah.
We've got an hour, just under an hour left. Oh, you mean of the 15 minutes?
Yes.
Looks like we've got 3 minutes left. We haven't solved any problems yet.
Yeah.
Should we start talking about it, actually? Should we talk about Mozambique's problem? Do we have enough information from the question to get going?
Yeah, so I think in summary, they said, look, only data is collected mainly in the cities, Maputo, Nampula, and Beira. And there are difficulties getting data for the rural areas for the central bank and government to make monetary policy relevant. I think that's the gist of it. And how can the government use technology in order to respond quicker to this requirement? Because at the moment they have people that do field work to gather the data, but that's slow, it's expensive, and the sample size is also small. So I think that was the summary of the problem. And then we need to see how to respond to that.
Okay. So I'll take notes. I would suggest everybody just pipe in then into, so we're supposed to recommend solutions for Mozambique.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, you all want to pipe in? I'm going to take notes only because I sort of have a bit more background on this than those of you who are in the course.
So one thought would be, obviously, licenses, businesses, retailers, agencies to do business across the country. So one way could be to collaborate or get information from them in terms of the business that they're doing. So if they're distributing flour or sugar to the rural areas, what's going on there? If they're mobile money agents operating in the rural area, is there a way that information can be used somehow to help with this data? Yeah, that's one thought. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think that's a great suggestion, because I think that just building on the Togo example, I mean, my question was, what other additional sources of data could there possibly be? So not knowing more about the situation, I mean, I don't know if they do a household survey like what is done in Togo, or just other potential sources of data in rural areas. Whether there's sales, I don't know if they have an agricultural marketing board perhaps that buys and produce that could also have data points, price data in rural areas as well.
So typically, maybe a question we could also ask is what sort of data would the central bank ordinarily collect, and how can we overlap that into these areas that you've just mentioned, to see if we can also extract that same data as well. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah, so maybe one way would be they would look at a sort of a basket, right? A consumer, what do you call the consumer price index. So there will be particular goods that consumers interact with frequently, and try to see the movement in those prices. Yeah, so maybe there's a unique dimension for rural areas. In fact, I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah, typically, I mean, in the urban areas, they might buy, bread frequently, but in the rural areas, maybe that might be a bit of a luxury, and they eat other.
But Melissa?
Yeah.
I can see you just joined.
Also, I can't find resource fits. He's there, but he's just not there. It's funny.
Oh, okay. So we are completely lost in this virtual space.
Yeah, so Geshi is taking over the other one. So that's going on. But I was just saying, you have 1 minute left so that I can close them. So it seems.
Can you close all of the group, or you cannot close the Hotzvetz's group?
I can close all the groups. I can't close just one. So it seems I only have the power to assign people, and then after that, they have to join the group I've assigned them to.
Oh, okay.
So I don't have any power to assigning people, which is just silly.
Okay. Yeah, I suggest we close the group work now, and we'll just, I mean, we didn't manage to get very far in this group simply because of these tech glitches, but it's okay. We'll just hear what the other group has to say, and we can talk in plenary to talk about possible solutions.
Yeah, they took lots of notes, so be prepared.
There's what?
They took lots of notes.
Okay, that's good. That's excellent. So we'll listen to their ideas. Great.
Okay. Closing groups now.
Are we saying it was purely technological solution, or can there also be some physical data collection?
They can also be data collection.
Okay.
It's a point I'll talk about in my presentation, but yeah.
Okay.
We are back from the other group.
Oh, you're back.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I was put into
Yes, where was Charles? You disappeared.
Yeah.
Charles joined the better group.
Ha! Gashi.
We were instructorless, so we had to be leaderless.
But you were there. How can you say that, Gashi?
Yeah, the grassroots took over.
Grassroots. We can break. We had one final type suggestion. I just don't remember who was the one who gave it. So I think we've got a potential idea. How was your group?
So I just want to make sure everyone is back in the main room. Melissa, can you confirm? Because I can see there's.
Yeah, everyone is back.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's, yeah. Okay, first of all, apologies for the tech glitches. I find that whenever I speak about tech and data science, we always face tech glitches. And I don't know if it's a problem with me or it's some kind of curse that when you talk about this sort of next generation of tech and data science, you're immediately hit by a lightning. Anyway, so I apologize for that. I think we ended up with 3 groups. As far as I understand, the Hotzvetz's group was fine, and you had a good discussion. In my group, we ended up with only 3 people. and very limited time. First, I was completely kicked off the platform. When I logged back on, I ended up in Rehotefetz's group and et cetera, et cetera. But I hear, Geshe, you kind of took over, the grassroots took over, isn't it?
No, you see, that's the way the grassroots work. It's not one person. So all 5 people were involved.
Okay.
But yeah, do you want us to give quick feedback or?
Yeah, I mean, if we can just do a quick, did you manage to discuss, did you get anywhere? Did you come up with any potential solutions or the outline of a solution?
We began to. I don't think we got far enough, but I think there were a lot of questions that were about, first of all, understanding what data it is the central bank normally needs, and then beginning to look, I guess, in a partnership mode, how we could perhaps get some of that data from, you know, businesses, retailers, boards like agricultural marketing boards. But a lot of that depends on understanding what kind of data it is we look at, and whether there are other ways of getting data proxies. A really interesting idea we began discussing just towards the end was that as you're looking at these rural communities, the question that was asked is actually, what's the big difference between rural Mozambique, Malawi, Rwanda, any of the countries around there? So is there any way perhaps that one can also proxy data across places that are quite similar, in fact, in character? And we talked a little bit about how, I guess, the only barriers sometimes to us thinking like that is the fact that we see countries as boxes, where in fact the characteristics of the populations may not be very different. So I think that was an interesting point. Then there was also a question about mobile phone data. And so even in rural Africa, most people do have mobile phones. So how far could we get, perhaps trying to see whether we could harvest from mobile data. So those are some of the points we were discussing, but I think there was this question of what data is it that we are looking for in the first place.
Yeah, no, great, and of course, I mean, it's a very complex problem, and we have very limited time, and as you're pointing out, there's a lot of context knowledge and context information that we don't have exactly what is the data landscape there, what kind of data does the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, what do they need? But it's a really interesting, I like the suggestion about using the fact that a lot of payments are using mobile phones, and it's a really interesting way of trying to track it, because even transactions in rural Mozambique, even very small transactions, are often done with some kind of mobile payments. So if you could access the data that is generated by commercial banks, you would be able to track or at least proxy the price fluctuations in the rural areas. So really nice, clever solution to that problem. Rehotefetze, do you want to, or do you have a rapporteur, or are you the rapporteur?
No, I'm not a dictator like that. We do have someone who was essentially, I mean, I did put into leading the charge, but if you don't mind giving feedback, I mean, I took some notes if you need me to jump in at any point.
Yeah, Reho, so the challenge for me is that at some point, I think it was, I don't know if it was automated, but I switched into another group.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You're bad. So we touched on a few. Let me just pull up my phone quick because I wrote my notes there. So we touched on quite a few notes, more around trying to better understand the problem. The group acknowledged, things that you could take advantage of. One would be high mobile penetration and how you leverage that. We knew that you could utilize some sort of mobile technology to try and deal with this problem. And then the question came, well, what type of information you're trying to gather? The group was prompted and they came up to the conclusion that, the type of data you want to collect, around prices, the types of goods that are on sale, the types of transport that takes place. There was a question around whether we understood all the information at hand. There was also a note around how do you leverage places where people congregate to further gain information. And in particular, in these places where people congregate, such as a market, for instance, you gain information from producers, informal sellers, customers in that area. There was a suggestion of an actual solution that was proposed. I just forget who it was in my group. If they just don't mind repeating their suggestion, that would be fantastic for us.
Was my suggestion about using enumerators at markets?
So it was yours, Christina, and then there was someone who followed you after you made that comment.
Yes, I can't remember who it was.
But you can make a suggestion as well.
I think it was Richard.
I think it was Richard as well. I'm not entirely sure, but
if there is a density of micropayments and exchanges between consumers and producers, that'll be reflected in the activity of interconnection that can be tracked through the cell phone network. So if an enumerator is on that point, then you would find out where people are doing the trading and what the prices are that they're settling on.
yeah. So yeah, no. I thought that was actually quite a clever idea, but that was our group.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm happy. Excellent solutions and really sophisticated. I'm very impressed, and I'm happy at least two of the groups managed to have a good discussion. I want to hand over to you, Fitz, but perhaps I should just quickly run through what was actually the solution that was implemented in Mozambique. I'll try to do it very quickly. It's not too far off some of the stuff you're suggesting, perhaps even it's simpler than I mean, one of the proposals was to sort of mine the data that's generated from mobile transactions, and the actual solution was also based on mobile phones, but a slightly different technique. So I'll just show you a couple of slides of to illustrate what happened. So okay, so this was the map here with the three areas where price data is available. So the solution for the Mozambican government in this case was to use mobile technology. And it's important to keep in mind here that most Mozambicans have a phone, but the phone they have is a very sort of basic GSM phone. Okay, so they have a mobile phone, they can send SMS, they can access USSD, but they cannot access the internet, for example. Again, also the network is rarely 3G, it's usually just second generation mobile technology or a GSM network. So the mobile technology has to be quite simple. So we cannot develop an app, we cannot do sort of very, very sophisticated stuff with the GPS location, etc. People don't have access to 3G networks and they don't have smartphones. So the solution for the Mozambican government is to use mobile technology and combine that with crowdsourcing. So, and it's actually, again, I said, it's a real life scenario, and it's a project that I've been involved in myself. So Sauti, which is the company that I'm involved in, partnered with the UN University World Institute for Development Economics Research. And we approached two, so in Mozambique there are three big mobile network operators, and we actually approached two of them and managed to negotiate access to their networks. And they agreed to give us free data using on their network as part of their CSI policy. So we created this partnership led by the Mozambican government, led by the Ministry of Economics and Finance, and the partnership was then Sauti, the company, and the UN, Vodacom, and TMCell, which is the state-owned mobile network operator in Mozambique. Very quickly, what is crowdsourcing? I mean, you probably, if you've ever read or heard about crowdsourcing, you might have heard this story before. So crowdsourcing is the idea that we can collectively, our estimate of something is better than the estimate of any individual. The classical example is we look at a picture of a cow and we all try to estimate how much does this cow weight. Most of us, we don't know. I certainly don't know. But on average, the idea is that on average, we actually know. Even if I don't know, you don't know, nobody really knows. Well, some people might know, but we as a group don't necessarily know. But on average, we do know how much a cow weighs. Some of us will overestimate the weight of a cow, and some of us will underestimate it. But on average, we will actually come very close to the real weight, the actual weight of the cow. Now, this was actually this example was actually tested or in the US one time, and I think it was the New York Times who showed people a picture of a cow and asked them what the weight of the cow is. And you can see here the distribution of answers. Some of them clearly here completely underestimated the weight, and there were some that overestimated the weight. But on average, the average of all these guesses were very close to the actual weight of the cow. So it turns out that in real life, each individual, each one of us don't necessarily know a specific fact, but on average, we can, based on sort of human reasoning and background knowledge, we all have different information, different knowledge, different experiences, and on average, we can come extremely close to the actual weight of a cow in this case. So we can use this idea of crowdsourcing to also get information about prices. So what we did in Mozambique was we got access to a lot of phone numbers, and we then sent SMSs to so we had a big pool of phone numbers or a big database of people. And we then sent these SMSs to a random sample of these people, inviting them to submit information about price data, okay? So we just send out, sort of blast SMS, send it out to these people and ask them information about specific price items. Here, I'm just giving you the example, how much does one egg cost? But in fact, we randomized the questions also. So some people were asked about eggs, some people were asked about rice, some people were asked about onions, some people were asked about cassava, whatever. All of these things were randomized. So the selection of people was randomized, the items were randomized. People then were invited to submit this information using USSD. So again, it's also a very simplified protocol that we can run. I mean, you probably know USSD from if you buy airtime or data for your phone, you will enter a short code and then you will get a menu. That's USSD. And the advantage of USSD, it gives the appearance of a menu. It's more refined or more visually. It's easier to read than an SMS, and it's something we can do also. We can exchange information also using USSD on a basic second generation GSM mobile phone. So people enter this short code 411, and they then submit price data. They tell us how much they paid for an egg or for a kilo of rice or whatever it is. So imagine they give us all these different prices. In exchange for sending us information about prices, we then send an airtime voucher. It's to create an incentive for them to participate. And they also receive information about prices in the area. So we create this, and it's a relatively simplified protocol where we can ask people about information about prices. We incentivize their participation by giving them these airtime vouchers and giving them information about prices in the area. And overall, the idea, and then is on average, the prices they give us will give us an estimate of prices in the area. Of course, the condition here is that we have to send a lot of SMSs. We have to engage with a lot of people. And that's why the collaboration with the mobile network operators was so important, because it gave us access to a lot of phone numbers, a lot of yeah, and they zero rated all of the activity, the data transmissions. This is just the website that was created for the project. So the project has been piloted now, and it'll be launched next month, and will run for a period of initial period of 6 months. And if successful, it will provide this high frequency data that will allow the Mozambican government and the central bank to respond effectively to price shocks. Okay, so it will actually give it's a relatively low cost way of collecting data, and it will give us almost sort of constant. It's not completely real time, but it will effectively allow us to collect price data on a daily or if not hourly basis, simply by constantly sending out these SMSs and incentivizing people to participate. And by submitting price data. So again, it's really still at a pilot stage, and it will run for a period of 6 months. And after that, the government, the Ministry of Economics and Finance, will evaluate the situation and then take a decision on whether to upscale it or continue the project, or just leave it as it is. But I just wanted to show you, this is also, I mean, you had excellent ideas, also some of them using mobile phones, and this is then an alternative option that combines this idea of around crowdsourcing, and combines the fact that Mozambicans have access to simple mobile phones, and integrate the two technologies or ideas to create a platform that allows us to create this data collection system. Okay, that's it for me. So apologies, we are running a little bit over time, but Rotsvetse, maybe you want to take over from here.
Yeah, so I'll go for about 20 minutes. Let me see. I don't want to share my screen. I just want to share this part. Sorry, let me just make sure. So hopefully everyone can see. Cool. Apparently it's going to give me subtitles. I do not want that. Cool. Fantastic. Hope you guys can hear me clearly. As Safran knows, I always have a random issue with sound. I should just get a set of headphones like his that have a proper microphone. But what I'm going to do in my 20 minutes here, and I might go quite briefly through things, so if I go too quickly, just slow me down, is that I'm going to point you in a direction. And pointing you in a direction means that you're the to choose if you want to walk down that path, if you want to walk in the exact path I pointed you in, or if you want to take a variation of things. But at the core of this, it's the idea of what are the principles that someone needs to start thinking about when they approach this notion of digital governance or digital transformation, or anything that involves, digitalizing public policy vis-a-vis, but by extension then government. And the way I like thinking about it is then how do you turn what seems to be this mountain, like that, this mountain of data that's being produced, this mountain of processing information, this mounting amount of technological advancements and all these different emerging technologies, how do you make it something into a molehill that you can understand without losing the dexterity, the veracity of the type of solutions that you're creating, right?
Sorry, I just side, but your sound seems to come in and out sometimes.
Oh, okay. Give me 1 second. Let me see if I can solve that. Sorry, everyone. Okay, is that any better?
So far, yes.
Okay, I'm just going to speak a bit louder. I'm doing the same thing on my system. Essentially, what do we do with all this data that's being produced, right? What do you do with this now as a public policy official, as someone who's working in civil technology? What do you do with the growing amount of data, the growing amount of processing power in order to understand this data and really analyze it? What do you do with the growing amount of different techniques to understand this data in order to make public value, really, at the end of the day, right? In order to achieve some sort of public interest for society. And furthermore, what do you do with a public policy process that for the past 200 years, but for the longest time has had a very simple idea of how policy gets made, right? That there's something that is important, You then discuss why this thing is important. You then devise some sort of solution to this problem that you've identified. You then implement a possible solution to it, and then you evaluate. But in a world in which you are surrounded by big data, in a world in which the connectivity is at its highest that we've seen, that entire model gets thrown out the window. As Halfdan said, things no longer become linear in your thinking. In this type of world, society now becomes a stage-by-stage process. The problem about the stages model is that it's a bit of a black box. With the amount of information that we produce now, digital governance has to completely reorientate itself to say, how do we have a form of continuous evaluation? And by continuous evaluation, that also demands a continuous iterative idea of what policy looks like and what it sounds like. Right? The first thing I want to tell everyone is, just because you're a developed country or first world country does not mean that you can fail at digital governance. Right? Simply being a rich country does not by virtue of that mean that therefore you are good at digital transformation. Anyone from South Africa to Togo to the United States of America can have some sort of issue when it comes to trying to move things to a digital. One case in point is healthcare.gov, and the Obama administration tried to really aspect of the Affordable Care Act. Live with their website, it was a whole big shebang, and the website crashed on the first day. They had about 4 million unique users, and only a handful of people could actually use this. Right? So as we talk about this, I want you to acknowledge that digital transformation is difficult for everyone. Right? It is not an easy task. It is not something that can simply be set into existence. But it's something that you, even though it might be difficult, isn't something that you should necessarily walk away from or avoid. All right. So often I get a bit frustrated in discussions about governance. People often skip over, or a discussion about digital transformation, because people often skip over, like, what is governance? What is a government? How are governments generally organized? Right, so we won't go through a lecture around governance, but essentially it's how government does its work, right? The exercise of political, economic, and administrative authority, right? The day-to-day affairs of government and how it goes about that. And over time, this evolved over time. It's moved from then, so the notion of let market do some of the things that the state can't do. Then people realize that that model might not be the best model, so you move to what they call quasi-market driven. You get this evolution of what is described as network governance, right? So in this type of world, this evolution of governance means that unlike these very few cases, and Estonia is a really good example, but it's one of those where they literally came out of a conflict, right? They were starting off as a base, but in a lot of situations we're now thinking of change. We're not starting from nothing, we're system saying. And I'm going to skip over this really quickly, but public management is probably one of the most dominating forms of governance across the world. The way the South African public administration is really centered around this, right? It's how do you push people into silos, bureaucratize, how do you focus on outcomes rather than inputs, but bear in mind processes we're going to get back to a bit later, the dominance of performance indicators, the preference organizations, but there's an addendum to that it doesn't mean just because you're lean and flat that all organizations are therefore equal. I mean, more organizations within government are more powerful, and then there's a wider use of market mechanisms to deliver public services. Now, these points all have particular principles that underpin them that create some really interesting challenges for any form of digital transformation. So when you think about any form of governance or government that is digitalized, I like to think of these 3 points that I get from Margaret, who I rely on quite a lot. Margaret is an academic at the University of Oxford, at the Oxford Internet Institute, and she's been writing about digital governance for the past 20 plus years now. And these points that she tries to highlight. One is government needs to be responsive, right? So any attempt to digitalize has to be responsive, and in particular, respond to dynamic transactional information, right? Often governments over the past 100 years have relied on what can be considered static data that they collect, right? So information, census information, information that they get from household surveys, right? It's not dynamic information. When we talk about transactional information, we're talking about every time someone picks up their phone for the rest of today, you've created a data point, right? You have created a trail of breadcrumbs that can follow your behavior throughout the day, right? Simply getting all the information from what you do on your cell phone in one day can become extremely valuable, not just to the private sector, but to governments as well. The other point is when you digitalize, you're digitalizing essentially to become efficient. One of my pet peeves in life is when people push digital transformation and then they digitalize efficiencies as well. And a case in point of this is the e-NATA system. For those who've tried to get a driver's license over the past years, you will be aware of the e-NATA system. But before you had the e-NATA system, in the way that we envision it, it was to get a driver's license appointment, you would have to call in. And then someone on the other end would then say, oh, look, we have appointments. If you live in Johannesburg, we have an appointment in Pretoria North. We have an appointment for you in Heidelberg. But the appointment is a month from now, or 2 months from now, or 3 months from now. When they created the e-NATA system, all that was done was to take the screen that someone else on the telephone was looking at and putting it on your computer screen. Now, that is technically digital transformation, but the question then becomes, have they made the system more efficient? The user experience is different, definitely, but is the system itself more efficient, right? Have you decreased waiting times to get an appointment, right? If I and my appointment was a month from now, and I go and my appointment is still a month from now, have you actually created any sort of efficiencies in the system? And the last point, which is a lot more controversial, and it's more of a choice than something that you have to do, and we'll touch on that just now, and it's this notion of how do you pursue an equality of outcomes and not necessarily an equality of process? So whether we like it or not, a lot of our governments are under this notion of bureaucracy, and the notion of bureaucracy put an emphasis that every person in the country has to go through the same, in inverted commas, the same bureaucratic approach to government, right? We all stand in the same line for a driver's license. We all stand in the same line for home. But when it comes to digitalizing, simply making the process equal for everyone isn't necessarily the best solution when you could potentially make the outcomes equal, even though the processes might differ, right? A good case in point of this would be the Department of Home Affairs. Now, we can have discussions around and a debate around efficacy here, but to have a process where you can still get the same passport through standing in a Home Affairs line versus getting the same passport through a digitalized system becomes interesting, right? It poses the question about, is that fair? And is that the type of thing you want to pursue? In my opinion, I think it is, because it moves you in the right direction, but it's the type of question around fairness that we have to engage in. That fairness shouldn't just be seen as making the process fair, but one could also focus on making sure, even though processes are different, that the outcomes are equal nonetheless. So I want to give, I'm very proud of this slide. I was going to use another picture instead, but I'm curious to hear what people think is the difference between these two stores, right? Obviously, assuming Google Play and App Store are the same type of store. But I'm not sure if I have enough time, but is there anyone willing to give me a quick answer of what they think is the core difference between these two stores?
Accessibility.
Accessibility.
Well, the one on the left doesn't track you after the sale.
One doesn't track you after the sale. There's also the
vending machine doesn't track you after the sale.
It doesn't track you after the sale. That's right. Any other thoughts?
The one gives me some review feedback before I choose, just based on my eyes.
Cool. Let's give reviews and feedback. What about choice? I mean, all these answers are 100% correct. I'm not 100% correct. What about the nature of choice?
Well, the one on the left is very limited choice.
Yeah, right. You see what you get, right? Compared to the one on the right, where what you see is not necessarily what you see is what you get, but there's a ton of more options available to you. Often when we think about government services in a digitalized world, it's almost the equivalent, and there's an academic called Kettle that really talks about this, but it's seen as if government services are like a vending machine. That I put my 2 cents into the vending machine or my 2 rand into the vending machine, and there are these pre-devised interventions or services that I gain back. Right? What if people just moved their preferences and they said, we no longer like Lay's chips for whatever reason? What is the timing in which it takes to change the Lay's chip in all vending machines in the country, right? Or whether it's M&Ms, right? What you see is exactly what you get. But on a platform such as an App Store or Google Play Store, the type of services and products that are created are extremely reactive to market forces, right? They are sensitive to customer feedback in particular. Like the Doritos in the vending machine, even if I complain about it, most likely nothing will happen. But on the Google Play Store, if I complain about a particular app and enough people complain about it, either that app will change or will purchase it, right? The notion of digital governance is how do you, and one particular notion, I mean, there's many, but how do you move thinking around the services that government gives away from the vending machine model and towards a platform model of sorts. Right? And there's different ways of understanding a platform, right? But how do you make digital services a bit different to the stock standard vending machine model? Right? And 2 core ways that people try and engage in this is the notion of engaging in co-production and pro. That at the heart of a digitalized world, whether we like it or not, and we'll take the Mozambique example, for instance, there are multiple steps within the Mozambique example and half-done solution that requires a level of co-production. Government by itself could not solve that problem, right? It deeply relied on private sector partners. It relied on transactional relationships between people. Right? It deeply relied on some sort of co-production of data, right? So you send out these SMS, people produce data to you. I mean, for the co-production of data through the work with telecommunication companies who give you the access to the numbers so that you can send out the SMSs and create this platform. Co-creation comes in the sense of how do you get individuals to participate in your digitalized world? That it's not enough just to give a service to someone, right? But if someone is producing information constantly that you can utilize and leverage, it almost becomes nonsensical to not leverage that to an extent, right? So if we take back the Mozambique example, rather than trying to create this data by sending enumerators out, you asked citizens themselves on a different type of platform to create this data for you, to give you information, right? So co-production becomes one of the 2 pillars that one really needs to think about when they engage in a digitalized forms of governance or government. Simply building a solution doesn't mean that people will use it, right? There's this assumption that if government solution will be the consumers and clients and citizens rather than back at themselves. And this logic holds for even the most advanced private sector company. For those who don't know, Google has tried to create multiple instant messaging apps, and the world just refuses to take them on board, right? For multiple different reasons. So simply building a digital solution to a problem doesn't mean that people will utilize it. So there's a few things I want you to just get your head around. My last few points here. Perceptions matter. How people perceive the usefulness of your technology or your technological solution is important, right? And the entire theories around it. Trust is important. If people don't trust, so enough research has now been done in interesting ways that shows that countries that have generally low, countries where citizens have a generally low level of trust in their government also seem to relate with a generally low take-up of digital solutions and digital services. Right, so a lack of trust in your particular solution will mean that people don't take it on. Regardless of where you are, political commitment has to happen. We could have an entire masterclass on this in of itself, but if your politics isn't committed to your digital notion of transformation, nothing will actually happen. The other points you need to keep at the back of your head are the notions of the diffusion of innovation, right? It's not about creating one particular innovation. Right? It's about how does your one particular innovation spur on other innovations, right? Almost as a product of your activities. Right? That it becomes really important to understand that simply building a government digital service, you're also providing the opportunity for people to then innovate on top of that. You do not have to be the organization that does it yourself. You have to be aware of a digital divide. Again, we could have an entire masterclass on this in of itself. Human capital becomes important. Often, the lack of human capital in government, people outsource digital transformation. So you'll see some of the leading people who do research on transformation are management consulting firms, accounting companies, and business rescue organizations, right? Because they realize that if government was to figure out how to insource their ability to devise these solutions, they would go out. Right, so human capital becomes interesting. You will not have any sort of digital transformation without the adequate ICT infrastructure, right? And the type of infrastructure that you create is extremely important. But the point I also want to make is that whether your system is centralized or decentralized also has important consequences. The last 2 points obviously is the affluence of your country, being aware of that and how that contributes to the digital divide and the development of digital services. And also the style, the nature of governance in your country. Not all countries are governed the same, and the governance system of a country will also determine the type of digital transformation you can embark on. So I know I'm running, so I'm going to go through the next few slides quite quickly, but at the heart of this, what you're really trying to get to think about a digital era of. This includes the fourth IR. This includes this notion of, digital transformation. This includes the idea of, advancing our government is reintegration, holism, and digitalization. Reintegration is key because of the impact of new public management on countries. That a lot of governments have worked in silos because of that frame of thought. A lot of governments essentially said, we will outsource services because we believe that the markets deliver services better, right? A lot of governments set up their institutions in such a way that government departments compete with each other for scarce resources, and therefore you don't cooperate with each other the way you would think so. A lot of governments would then reproduce systems, right? So one government will have a data set on ID numbers, and another government department will have the exact same data set on ID. Data sets can't be reconciled, for instance. So you need to create a sense of shared process. You need to create a sense of how do you simplify things and reintegrate what was a fragmented government and bring it back together. Holism is that the way you design your digital services should be focused when you think about the service you're going to all the way to the experience of its end user or its citizen, right? It has to be a complete rethinking around processes can become one-stop, how you can co-produce, how you can make sure that the intervention that you have thinks about the value chain from the beginning to the end. And obviously digitalization is how you automate, put things onto the internet, etc. So these 5 do's and these 4 choices. And again, the reference I'm going to give at the end is from Helen Margetts and Patrick Dunleavy in particular, who really have pushed these principles guiding notes, right? It points you in the right direction, but doesn't necessarily say you have to go down it. So the first one is, when you're thinking about digital interventions, as much as possible, public services that are digitalized should be free, right? A public service that is on a digital platform should ideally be free and not be paid for. And free in inverted commas could mean many things, right? Certain websites the government has should technically, I believe all government websites should be 0 rated, right? No one should be able to have to use their data to access a government website, for instance. There are examples and arguments of, if one creates a platform in which you digitalize the process of getting a passport, you don't then have to pay for your passport the way you would have if you went through a formalized bureaucratic system, right? If you've done a holistic understanding of the efficiencies and inefficiencies, you've digitalized your solution in order to for those inefficiencies, it should ideally then say you've created enough economies of scale that service is free. Right? But it's not everything, but it's a particular do you should follow. The other one is use already existing digital information. Don't try and recreate when information is already there. Right? So let's take the Mozambique example. Telecommunication organizations already have people's cell phone numbers. It would then be nonsensical to embark on an exercise of government actively collecting cell phone numbers themselves. Right? Try as much as possible to use already existing digital information. Do it once, right? Give people the experience of a one-stop shop as much as possible. There's one of my pet peeves in life is going into the Department of Social Development and giving them my ID number, and then going to, for instance, the Transport Department and then giving them my ID number. It becomes a frustrating exercise because in my mind, government should have this information already, and why should I give it multiple? The processes that you create should give people the experience of doing something once and only once. And Estonia is a really good example of how they go about that type of logic in their intervention. The other one is grow scalable services and competition. Avoid the idea of becoming a monopoly on digital transformation. All the solutions that you should create should ideally be in competition with others, but that just might be my own ideological output here. But the solution should be scalable, infinitely scalable, right? And an extent that you could essentially have this digital service for 2 times the size of your country, in essence. So I'll do this quickly. Isocratic administration essentially says let people also do it themselves. If individuals can create their own public service solutions that assist government, you shouldn't vary of those solutions if they are good for you. Right? So again, government doesn't have to solve everything itself when it comes to digital transformation. And often people think that's the case, that digital transformation is making sure that government can do things themselves just a lot more efficiently. Where in case you can find out that you have situations where people can assist quite dramatically. And then we have, as I said before, and so I won't spend too much time on this, you've got what we say value equality of outcome over process. But in an digitalized world, there is no one way to do things, right? Within government, there's been a history of trying to do things in a standardized fashion, right? That government processes should be standardized as possible across all different departments, right? In an increasingly digitalized world, if you're going to be trying to do iterative learning, if you're trying to do what we'll talk about just now, experiential learning, if you're trying to innovate consistently, what you'll end up having is that processes will differ. You'll find different ways to get a particular policy or solution out into the public. What you really should be thinking about is how do you ensure that there's an equality of outcome regardless of the process? Now, how I could talk for ages around this, but there has to be a reconsideration around the formal rights when it comes to digital transformation and the type of real redress that happens. Halfdan has a brilliant article and can talk more to this than me on this notion of whether data should be considered a public good. And a quick example I'll give you as my last 2 comments is the amount of data we generate on Spotify, right, that creates value for people. So Spotify is a music streaming service that provides value to Spotify. Even though you have created that data yourself and they use it, you get compensated for your efforts. Like you pay Spotify, but you're essentially making Spotify richer every single time that you listen to music there. So you're a work of Spotify, technically, one could argue. Do you pay? So we have to have a re-understanding of what data rights even look like in this world. Keeping the state nodal essentially says allow people to operate with the state and allow people to make contributions to your efforts. And the last one and the most important, and I'll end here, is experiential learning. That everything has to be iterative, right? You need to experiment with your solutions. The solution that you think is good today, by virtue of the type of communications that we have, by the speed of information that we get, your intervention that's good today might become outdated the next day. And government should be bold enough to experiment and constantly learn from their failures. And this is the reason I want to dig in deeper for it, or if you have any questions around these particular 5 do's and choices, that's it. And that is me. I apologize for going over half done. That is my.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rehotefetse. I apologize for the delays. We were hoping there would be more time for Q&A and discussion, but I know Rehotefetse is giving a lecture now at 10 o'clock, so he might have to leave us, but I could stick around for another 5-10 minutes if there are anyone who wants to say something or ask a question. Feel free. And again,
can I just add that you've given my email. If anyone wants to pop me an email or questions, just send it to me. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But thank you. So I do have to rush to a lecture, but thank you so much for participating in this, and I hope you guys found some.
Okay. Any questions? I mean, there's been a couple of questions on the chat. I think I responded to most of it, but I just want to give you a chance if there's anyone who wants to ask another question or have comments, reflections, something. It doesn't look like it. Well, I decide to interpret that as a sign that everything was clear, everything made sense, and you have no questions. But okay.
I had one half done that I could ask.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have raised my hand.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
My hand is raised. So, I mean, you started off with talking about the story of Estonia, and we've been talking about how we get there. Do you have any sense from a governance perspective whether Estonia is considered to be doing better due to all of this digitalization and the progress it's made in that regard from a developmental or a social perspective? So is there any evidence that just being more digitized means that they're better governed and the policies are better?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and I'm afraid I can't give you a clear answer because it's a sort of a chicken and egg problem, and a classical. It's a classical problem in economics of you're trying to disentangle cause and effect, but in most cases, things are just correlated, and you can't necessarily say what came first. in this case, so what is, did economic development cause this digital transformation, digital reforms in Estonia, or was it the reforms that caused economic development? I would say it's both. One sign that the transformation came first is perhaps that some of these decisions were taken extremely early. Remember, the Estonian economy really just took off in the sort of early 2000s, but some of these decisions were taken already in the early 90s, in the mid 90s. So at a very early stage, the government, and as I said in my introduction, it was really out of necessity. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the administration, they didn't have the legal code. So they had to take decisions around what kind of society do we want to build. And that happened about 5-10 years before we started seeing this boom. Now, obviously, a lot of other factors came into play, but I mean, I would certainly argue that the transformation of the public sector, the sort of adoption of technologies, adoption of some of these technologies that we're talking about, data science, et cetera, is part of the explanation as to why Estonia has been so successful. And I think a good sign, again, the economic development really started in the early 2000s, and by, as I said in the beginning, by 2001 already Estonians were filing tax returns online. In 2002 they used digital ID, digital signatures, etc. So that's a very academic answer to a fairly simple question. I apologize, Geshe.
No, thank you. And then there is a question from Charles on the chat about whether they will be allowed access to the presentations.
Sure, we can do that. I don't know is there a way we can, do we have email addresses of anyone, or how are we going to distribute the presentations? But I'm happy to share the slides, yeah.
We do. So Melissa, I think you can assist with that.
Okay.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know, do you think there's a real willingness from governments to move to digitization in terms of processes that have to do with public service delivery, you know, when taking into consideration the fact that some of these processes are really not digitized, or when you bring about a digitization and sort of like that type of technological processing, you cut, you know, many people out of the system. So it then reduces the levels or opportunities for corruption, wastage, and so on, because things are streamlined. There's processes, there's innovation, so there's less need for human interventions and so on. So do you think governments are really willing to move to digital platforms?
It's a very good question, and it's something that we could talk a lot about. But this whole political economy around digital transformation, it's a very good question, and certainly I do think that in most government, not just South Africa, any government, there would be vested interest that would push back, because bureaucracy creates opportunities to seek grants, to extract resources from the administration. And if you through implementation of digital solution, if you cut out the middleman, well, of course that middleman doesn't have that privilege anymore. So it's a really good question, and I don't think there is one answer to it, but it's certainly, and I do think that it's something often that academics and practitioners working in this space of digital transformation and public sector reform, they often forget the political dimension of what they're doing. So they're just focused on clever technological solutions, and we are going to connect citizens directly to decision makers, and we are cutting away red tape, all of that stuff. But they forget about the political dimension, or the political economy dimension, that actually there might actually be people in the system who will deliberately undermine what you're trying to do. So Excellent question, and it's an area that I'm very, very interested in myself, and I think it's an area that has been largely overlooked by academics and practitioners alike.
Okay, so just another follow-up on that. How do you think civil society can then advance or accelerate the rate at which we move to a digital space in terms of service delivery, policy implementation? How does our electoral system also affect the ability for local governments, for example, to efficiently put policy into action? Because every 5 years there's elections, and every year each government official wants to secure their next 5 years. So I don't think there is a real focus on ensuring that policies are efficiently implemented, and the evaluation of those policies doesn't really happen. So I don't think our electoral system is conducive for growth, for ensuring that we advance as a country, even as a region. So my questions are really around, how does the civic community then get involved? How do we advance or accelerate digitization and ensuring that we are able to hold governments accountable in areas where they are not pulling their weight using technology?
Yeah. Another excellent question, obviously related, and I wish we had more time to discuss it, but it's a very important point, and I mean, you specifically mentioned something about the electoral system, and it's very true. I mean, there are quite a few examples from particular Southern Africa where now it's getting a little technical, but so the electoral systems of most countries in Southern Africa are what we call closed PR systems. Okay, so it really gives a lot of power to political parties. A lot of the accountability, a lot of democracy happens within political parties, whereas the accountability between political leaders and citizens is somehow moderated by political parties. The consequence of that is that if you are a politician, your loyalty, your accountability often is to the leaders of your party rather than necessarily the people or the citizens you are serving. The result is that we have seen examples of sort of citizen, super interesting sort of citizen service delivery feedback mechanisms, scorecards where a citizen can complain and say, oh, there's a pothole in my road, or this and that service is not working. Interesting platform systems where that information is fed back into the public administration and the policymaking process. But if the people who are mandated to respond to those complaints, if they don't have incentive to do it, simply because, well, they're more interested in responding to their party leaders rather than responding to the people who complain about potholes. If that incentive doesn't exist, well, then you can develop the most sophisticated system, the most sophisticated platform, and it wouldn't really produce any change. Simply because, again, the platform itself is not adapted to the context. It doesn't take into consideration the political economy dynamics around the solution, and that's, I mean, there's a lot. Again, we could talk a lot about it, but Rotofeta had a point about technological innovations or technological solutions do not necessarily lead to more efficiency, and one of the reasons simply is because, well, it has to be aligned with the politics. It has to be aligned with the political dynamics around the solution or the reform. It's a big topic. It's a super interesting topic, and it's something we recently started a small research project with CTIN, specifically on civic tech. You also asked how citizens can get involved and how civil society can contribute. So we just started a research project on South African civic tech, on African civic tech, and again, we talk about civic tech, but there's very little information about what civic tech actually is and what civic tech actually does, and when does it work and when doesn't it work. What's the what's the financial construction, what's the business model around a lot of civic tech initiatives. So it's a research area that we're just starting to look at. So stay tuned, and hopefully more will follow. I see a lot of, oh, that's Geshi. Geshi, do you want to, so I think we probably need to wrap up now.
Yes.
Geshi,
Yes.
do you want to say something about the next masterclass?
Yeah, so I tried to avoid that by putting it in the chat. So I think Melissa
okay.
is screen sharing there, that we'll be having Alexandra presenting the next one next week, same time. I'm not sure if it's the same place. There's probably a different link for that. And yeah, we'll be talking more about, more the kind of political activism side of it. So for those of you who are interested in that, I think it will be a great session. I've also just tried to share further to what Halfdan was just sharing, the research that he's referring to. We'll post updates on our website. And we'll continue to look at how sessions like this, and drop us an email if you have suggestions or ideas about how this kind of content could be rendered more usefully. If you have questions, of course, to Halfdan and Safetha, you could also send that directly. But just to thank you, Halfdan, and to Wits for availing, well, you availing yourselves, and then obviously the university enabling that. Thank you very much for that. I hope the participants have found it useful, and we will see you at future sessions.